Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Health Innovators. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. I'm joined today by Jennifer Goldsack, CEO of the Digital Medicine Society, also known as DIME, and Amy Abernethy, President of Clinical Studies Platform at Verily and former FDA bigwig. And we're doing this video as sort of a kickoff for a series of articles that we're going to collaborate with the Digital Medicine Society on, really as a how-to for pharma companies getting into the digital therapeutic space. And what we're going to be talking about in this episode and a second sequel episode is data in healthcare, big data in healthcare, where it is now, how far it's come in the last few years, and what that means for everyone in the space, including our core audience in the pharma space. So welcome to the show, Amy and Jen.
Thanks, Jonah. Great to be here.
So we've been having this conversation for a while now about data in healthcare and its capacity to transform care. But in the last couple of years, it feels like we've turned a corner, partly, I think, because of COVID. But I'd love to hear what you guys think about that. How would you characterize the sort of current landscape when it comes to being data-driven in healthcare?
So perhaps I'll start. I think that we've turned the corner, Jonah. As I think about it, we've gone from this theoretical concept that we need to be data-driven to actually clear examples of where we're data-driven in clinical development. So leveraging data for discovery, leveraging data to plan better clinical trials and clinical studies, leveraging data from many sources now to actually get the studies done. We've seen data help us in documenting and improving healthcare quality. We've seen data now driving our clinical decision support systems, as well as informing the development of the algorithms, and certainly data that helps us inform implementation. So we're seeing examples of how data work for us all across these spaces. And COVID did really, truly bring that not just to light in specific pockets, but in a way that the lay public could see the role of data every single day as we're trying to figure out, whether or not you could go outside or go back to school in your local environment by looking at the COVID rates by your county, or looking at the data from Israel to understand the performance of the mRNA vaccines and the duration of effectiveness, and do you need a booster, and what about children? So there's been a lot of ways in COVID that data has brought this story to the fore.
Interesting, kind of on every level, whether it's the providers or just individuals using data.
And Amy, I think that's exactly right. And I think it comes down to, and you and I have had this conversation before, which is, what is the digitization of healthcare and research anyway, right? What does that even mean? And it comes down to the data. And, in our field, we've always used data to make risk benefits decisions. But the difference now is that there are streams of data that it sort of flowing at a rate and a velocity that we've never had access to before. And essentially the difference in the digital era, and Amy, you'll have good ideas about this, but to me is that, it's not locked in a manila folder in a file cabinet that either only the PI has the key to, or only the practice manager has the key to. Ostensibly, this data should be able to flow with the appropriate permissions. We should be able to look at these enormous data sets, multiple people who can make valuable decisions, whether it's the patient themselves, Amy, in the COVID examples you just gave, public health administrators, whether it's treating physicians, whether it's medical product developers, whether it's early stage clinical scientists looking for, signals in the data that may inform new approaches to discovery. This is the difference, right? Is that we've gone from this, I own the physical hard copy of data and it is an episodic snapshot, to there is a high velocity flow of data that with the appropriate permissions, multiple people can have access to. And I think that's the tipping point. And these things have come together, right? The ability to capture data and store data in new ways, the computing power that we now have in order to analyze these things to make better risk benefit decisions. And this moment in time where we've recognized the power of this data across the industry.
I want to hit on one thing though that Jen was saying, which is that data is starting to flow, and with the right permissions, our ability to now use it and actually see the value of the use of data in real life, which is part of what we're getting at. But there's also been an expanding concept of what is or are data in what I call all directions. So we've gone from thinking just about data that must be prospectively collected in really defined ways for each individual research question or experiment, to not just prospectively collected data, but data that exists across the ecosystem that we can make sense of. Information in the electronic health record, genomics, microbiome, social determinants of health, information directly from people, including what people value, symptoms, quality of life, sometimes formalized in patient-reported outcomes and sometimes not formalized, but surveys and questionnaires. We also see now the ability to use data, for example, environmental exposures, GPS and geocoding, all of which can help us get a 360-degree view of health. And that understanding of how, for example, geocoding and sensors have helped us in the environmental context, in the weather context, other aspects of life, now is also leading to thinking about how do we leverage sensors and new capabilities for new data streams that can help us understand things like movement and sleep and performance in life. So now new data sets that we can leverage as well.
So there are definitely new data sets. There are also old data sets that previously we didn't have access to, or didn't have the infrastructure, the computing power to process. I mean, there are so many other pieces between just having the data and being able to use it effectively. And a phrase that came up when we were sort of doing the pre-meeting for this talk was data everywhere and not a drop to drink, which I think is your coin, Jamie. Tell me what that means, and where are we, with being able to use the data that exists.
So it's really an interesting little story here, Jonah. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was asked to think about writing a review for the National Academy of Medicine with Peter Lee, David Shaywitz, and others about the miracle of digital health in managing the pandemic. And this was, you can kind of imagine, this is now April of 2020. Everybody thought, oh, this will all be done by September of 2020, and we'll be able to document all the ways that digital health and data have solved our world. And in fact, what we discovered was that really one of the things that the pandemic brought to the fore was the criticality of data, the many pockets of data, but the reality that you can't just say, oh, yay, data are there, mash them all together, or put them into a big cauldron and stir it around and think that data are going to perform for you. You've got this issue of how data are stored and characterized, this issue of the appropriate permissions that are needed and who owns what, and appropriate governances. And even then, even if you start to have data flow and have interoperability and be able to link data sets, then you run into all kinds of quality challenges and data conflict errors. And if you're going to inform confident use of data, inform real insights, you actually need to be able to solve for all of these. And I can tell you, trying to solve for them in real time in April of 2020 of the pandemic was very hard to do. And I think the pandemic really brought that into focus and has highlighted some critical things that we need to solve for going forward.
Amy, I think it's such a powerful example, and we've been doing a body of work with some partners here at Dime around sensor data integrations, right? And data integrations as a challenge sort of extends across the digital health data ecosystem, but thinking specifically about these new types of data that are collected, outside of the context of the clinic, and what we see happening is just as you say, there's all of this data that ostensibly should provide this incredibly valuable information. It goes in a native format to a proprietary cloud. How do you get that out? How do you triangulate that information? How do you access it so you can actually drive better decisions faster? Ultimately, it comes down to accessibility, sort of reliability and relevance and sort of trustworthiness. But establishing all of those things are multifactorial. And then you get to all of the interoperability challenges. So I think there's a few things that we have to do. We have to think of this as a very dynamic environment. And Amy, you speak about that sort of really nicely, but also the sheer existence of data doesn't mean that we have better information for decision making. Data is an inanimate object, and we have to be able to harness it through our scientific approaches and also through the infrastructure in order to tease out that valuable information to drive those decisions.
And one follow-on from that, Jen, and again, this kind of came up in the beginning of the pandemic, is that, first of all, learning how to use data, being able to confidently drive insights, it actually takes practice. Data are only as good as you've used them and put them to work and learned about the value and the warts. And so one of the issues with really learning to work with data is to solve for all of these intricacies that we've been talking about, but also to practice and to show what's possible, but where also are the problems that are going to need to be solved. And I think that's one of the things that also became really clear in the pandemic that we need to do.
Yeah. I mean, this may be a little bit of a diversion, but thinking about how long we've been working on this, I know in my early days writing about digital health for Moby Health News, I would talk to doctors who would say, we don't we recognize the potential of this data, but right now we don't know how to use it. It's too much. We don't, it's a fire hose. We have busy days. We aren't able to drink from that. And on top of that, we're worried about liability. If there's information in there that, could help, but we're not able to access it. And, does that make us liable? So, I mean, the problems are kind of pretty extensive and not always things that you'd immediately think about.
So when I was at Duke, we ran a system for collecting patient-reported information, so symptoms and quality of life for every cancer patient who came from the clinic. And as we first started to do that, there were two use cases that were really interesting to try and work through. One was doctors who were legitimately worried that the access to these large data sets would showcase differences in doctors' ability to manage symptoms and manage patient concerns, and might that actually create an unexpected liability? And then the parallel one, which was we were asking questions that might point to suicidal ideation, and what risks do you have if you know that kind of critical information? So we kind of ran into this question of do you put your head in the sand and never ask about suicidal ideation, or do you try and figure out how to do so in responsible ways? And these are the kind of things we have to figure out as we go along.
Amy, those are really powerful examples. And the question that we often ask ourselves, and you and I have had conversations along these lines, are what's the same and what's different compared to what we've done before? And so with these extraneous findings, there's actually a really good body of literature, and Amy, you'll know it substantially better than I do, but we've seen this before, right? With incidental findings in imaging, right? And we have rubrics around how we handle these things, right? If we are searching for a measure, if it is validated, if we know what we are looking at, if it's in the consent form that we are going to respond to it, we handle something one way, right? If it is truly an incidental finding, there's a variety of there's almost a rubric that you can go through in order to process these things. And it may be imperfect, but these questions have been asked before. And I think starting with where has the work been done to address these questions and these challenges is really important. And then, the thing that you mentioned, Jonah, that always sort of gives me pause is around, how am I, as a busy clinician, how am I going to keep on top of all of these new data that I'm being asked to look at? And we think about, the state now where we have, a clinician staffing crisis, where we know what our clinicians go through every single day treating patients. Now they need to sort of service the EHR. Now they have to service the patient portal and be responsive through those means. And then we want them to get to the end of the day and flick through myriad dashboards of all of their patients. We have to think differently. And Amy, really curious about your thoughts on this. If we are just reducing these rich flows of data down to these dashboards and these snapshots, I think we are losing so much of the nuance that's in there. There should be flows of data that shows that a patient is performing well, that you don't have to think about them, that you don't have to review them. And then how can we use triggers, algorithms to show which patients actually warrant some outreach, and what members of the care team could we use that may not always be the physician?
So, as we actually kind of care about and have empathy for the healthcare provider edge or lens of all of this, I anticipate there's actually almost two directions that we have to have empathy. One is what I call the wrap the healthcare provider over the knuckles problem, which is the number of times that I have been in situations, companies, where, practically speaking, the point is, well, the doctors are just going to have to enter more accurate information, and we need to force them to do it. And we did this experiment at Duke. We made it so that the EHR wouldn't progress to the next chemotherapy ordering screen unless doctors entered a certain number of fields. And then we measured how many fields doctors would enter accurately. And what we found was that junior doctors, so like resident, would enter 7 variables until they just started entering the letter Q to just kind of get the whole thing to move forward. For a early attending, it was 5, and for a senior attending, it was 3. So you're not going to get very much. Otherwise, you just get noise like, erroneous cues being entered to the system. So one is having empathy that we can't ask healthcare workers to be our data janitors. Like, we have to think about how do we get our data ready, cleaned up, and made valuable in the surround sound around healthcare, not by forcing healthcare to be the component to do it. And the second side of this is, if we want data to work for us at the clinical interface, right? Then we need to actually get smarter and smarter to surface just the information people need when they need it, and also legitimately not surface information that's unnecessary. And part of the problem is we're still not good at that. We're not good at it because we were talking about liability concerns a few minutes ago. We get kind of really caught up in all of those questions. What am I allowed to do? What are the regulations? What am I going to get in trouble for? What's the right thing to do? And we just haven't figured out yet. Last thing I would say is kind of in both of these topics, both like how do we solve for the healthcare provider challenge and crisis that we're in, as well as how do we solve for some of the kind of challenges we went into on liability, et cetera. It strikes me that, as you said, Jen, we've got prior experiences that we can bring to the table. But oftentimes when you're the person like suddenly trying to figure that out with your data set, your system as the healthcare provider, you're pretty stuck, and it's hard to see all those solutions. And places like Dime become the right place, the right system, where many people can bring good ideas to the table and create the safe interface and forum to figure out how to get these things right.
So let's talk briefly about the pharma stakeholder and how this conversation winds back around to them. And I think in doing so, it's probably a good time to talk a little bit about kind of digital therapeutics and because it seems to me that the one of the ways that pharma becomes involved in this is when an intervention based around data for, say, a chronic condition actually becomes part of the treatment, and it is kind of developed and regulated as a treatment, similar to some other therapy.
So it's a really interesting question in so many different directions, because there's a ton of ways that pharma and data come together, and also regulators, I would say, in this overarching story. And I think we still have a ton of things to do and things to learn, but a few observations. The first is that as we're learning how to leverage data in new ways, either to support the clinical development of pharmaceutical intervention, so being able to run faster, smarter clinical trials or leveraging real world data, or if we're actually thinking about digital therapeutics, for example, as an intervention itself, both of these are going to require us to get smarter and smarter about what good looks like. And pharmaceutical companies are challenged if they try and do it in the vacuum. And regulators are challenged if they try and do it in a vacuum too. Like, what the pharmaceutical company wants is for regulators to say, here's the rules, this is what you need to follow. But practically speaking, how can regulators write all of the rules if they haven't seen all the possibilities of what might get done? And meanwhile, the pharmaceutical companies having a hard time putting out their next clinical trial or their next digital therapeutic if they don't know what the concerns that the regulators are going to have. And so what I've learned is, during my time at FDA and watching in the context of COVID, is that pilots, public-private partnerships, times when people are working together, during COVID was one really great example of this, really creates this really important crucible that allows sort of the ideas to flow about what's possible and what good can look like. And I think this is a really important thing for us to acknowledge, is all of these things are in development right now. If I think about, for example, the evaluation of software as a medical device and digital therapeutics, how that's going to happen, what those regulatory pathways are going to look like in the future, I don't think we fully know yet. And until we start doing the work to say, here is the possible, I think we're going to continue to be in this space of not really sure exactly how that's always going to happen. Jen, any thoughts?
I mean, I think that's exactly right. And you have a lovely term that I've quoted many times, Amy, around building regulatory muscle. And I think it's really powerful when we talk to industry, right? This idea that, everyone who's working in this space has spent years in-house building confidence, really deeply understanding the science and the technology that goes into this, and is still on that journey. The idea that in X amount of time, you can then present a packet to our regulatory colleagues and say, accept this, and just expect that to work without ever having sort of worked together, communicated, shared learnings for better and worse, in order to sort of drive that confidence and acceptance among everyone in the ecosystem, does seem, technical term here, more than a bit bananas. And, I think what we have to get to, and Jonah, to your point, is moving from data, moving to insights, and then to application, right? What does this actually look like when we start to apply it? What are those unintended consequences that we may not even be aware of yet? And there is a field called regulatory science, right? And that always has to precede sort of any sort of regulatory policy. And we're still building that corpus of science. There are still methodological questions. There are still, risks that we may not fully understand yet, benefits that we may not fully understand yet. And Amy, to your point, we do much, much better when we pull up a chair, at the same table and work together on this and bring the full expertise of the community to bear, because collectively we have to answer these questions. There are pressing and real challenges that we need to address here. There are sort of indications where we don't yet, after decades of effort, have any disease-modifying treatment or cure. There are pressing challenges to the efficiency and the sustainability of the clinical trials environment. There are underserved populations, underrepresented populations. There are these enormous disease states, right? I think about something like major depressive disorder or Alzheimer's. The idea that they're one single diagnosis and that we aren't able to yet tease out these phenotypes where we may actually have pockets of responders we can already help. We have to be able to answer these questions. And if we do it as an army of one, we're not going to get there in a time that is acceptable to the patients that our industry is supposed to serve.
And I would add, there are disease spaces where we don't even have sort of reliable quantitative biomarkers, and people working on developing so we don't even know how to measure what we can't measure. So and then once you have those biomarkers, you have to get a regulator to approve and understand them, so that when you submit some therapy that's measured in those biomarkers, they know what the heck you're talking about. It's layers upon layers.
And then down the road from that, right, you then have to get market access, which means you have to have a payer community or an HTA body that says, okay, I also believe this data and I also think that this shows value. And then you have to have a clinician who's willing to prescribe that new sort of therapeutic product. The idea that we can do this in a silo, I think, is such a flawed assumption. And actually, Amy, to your point, I agree with you. I think that that's one of the biggest changes that we saw during the course of the pandemic. This idea that we have to come to the table and behave more collaboratively and advance this, new, I almost said new field, but I don't think that's helpful. These new tools in the toolbox and advance our understanding of the value and how they can be harnessed to solve these pressing and persistent challenges. We have to do it together. And to me, that was the greatest sea change throughout the course of the pandemic.
Well, thank you so much. We've had a great, I think, groundwork setting overall discussion of this topic. I'm going to end part one here. We're going to come back in part two, and we're going to start to talk specifics, talk about some of the things you guys have seen in your practice, in your experience of how to do this well, and maybe pass along some lessons along the way. So thank you both very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jonah.